Welcome to the ATMA Country Update webinar for Hong Kong and China. I'm Meng, and I'll be moderating this webinar alongside our industry colleagues, Li Chen and Ephraim Goldberg. This is part of our regular webinar series, providing you with a concise update on the mobility landscape in the various countries. If you have missed our previous country updates, reach out to us. We have recordings available. Please do also feel free to ask questions through the Q&A chat box as we proceed with the webinar. Today's agenda includes an introduction to ATMA, followed by location updates. Ephraim will provide insights on Hong Kong, while Lee will cover the cost of living for both locations. Then we will be collectively address China updates and answer any questions that you might have. So who is ATMA and why ATMA? If you are here the first time, this might be new. If you have joined our other webinars before, so this might be information that you already know. So ATMA stands for Asia Telemobility Alliance. It is the first global mobility trade organization solely focusing on Asia. It's crucial because 40% of the sending and receiving locations for mobile employees are in Asia. Over 40% of companies expect to increase workforce mobility in Asia, still a very big number. Currently, there are no global mobility trade organizations specifically focusing on Asia only. ATMA is also a non-profit organization that is located in Asia, actively supporting the talent mobility and relocation community, as well as solely dedicated to Asia talent mobility. We'd also like to extend our gratitude to our foundation partners, ECA International, Relo Network Asia, as well as Gravel, who are instrumental in making ATMA a reality. If you're interested in becoming a foundation partner, please do reach out to any of our board of directors. I can blend them in here. Compromised by professionals from both in-house HR and the provider side, bringing a diverse knowledge and experience to ATMA. This diversity also makes ATMA a true representation of talent mobility in Asia. Do feel free to contact any of us or any of the board members to learn more about an ATMA membership. And now I think we just dive right in, and I hand it over to Ephraim for Hong Kong.
Thanks, Meng. We're going to dive in and take a look at the landscape for global mobility in Hong Kong. Quick look at immigration and housing, and then education as well. And then Lee's going to step in and give us the bird's eye view on cost of living developments in Hong Kong. So starting with the global mobility landscape in Hong Kong right now, what's going on? So basically, economically, Hong Kong's starting to look a little more stable after having had a bit of a rough patch in recent years. Unemployment rate for business professionals now back down to the pre-COVID levels of around 3%. We're seeing continuing strong inbound movement from, in particular, mainland China, both in the Chinese professionals and graduates. There's also some return of executive level relocation into the city, as well as, interestingly, the return of someone who actually left Hong Kong during COVID, especially to settle in Singapore. And we're also seeing the return of Hong Kong summer internship programs for various financial institutions which were suspended during COVID. Ongoing challenges do remain, though. There's still a fair amount of uncertainty. Galvanizing the economy on an enduring and long-term basis is still up for grabs. And the geopolitical tensions that Hong Kong's been caught up with between mainland China and in particular the US and Europe are still ongoing. So a relatively high degree of uncertainty about the economic future of Hong Kong still remains, but still some positive signs. On the immigration front, the top story is really the TTPS, the Top Talent Pass Scheme. So this is a Hong Kong scheme, Hong Kong government scheme aiming to attract top talent with rich work experience and good academic qualifications from all over the world to explore opportunities in Hong Kong. As of June 2024, just shy of 90,000 applications had been received, with around 59,000 of those having been approved. PRC nationals account for close to 95% of the nearly 50,000 applications approved as of the end of 2023, and that proportion of the overall approval seems to be extending into 2024. PRC nationals also make up the bulk of applicants under the various other visa schemes offered by the city, and around 30,000 successful applicants in total have actually moved to Hong Kong. Last week's Chief Executive Policy Address, the list of universities under this TTPS Top Talent Pass Scheme was expanded, and high income talent is to be granted longer term visas. So that's the key development on the immigration front of late. We move on to the housing. Yeah, housing, of course, in Hong Kong, housing is always an issue in some way, shape, or form, positive, negative, positive or negative. On the longer term rental housing side, there has been and continues to be a surge in demand for rental property. This is due to multiple factors, not least that prospective buyers are actually postponing their purchase plans due to rising interest rates, and also waiting for an expected correction in the sales market, thereby creating additional pressure on the rental market for the residential rental market under 60,000 Hong Kong dollars per month. This market segment remains particularly active, but there is lower demand in the super luxury residential segment, in the 200,000 Hong Kong dollars or above rental category. Overall rental rates are up 6% year on year across the market. And unsurprisingly, perhaps tenants are still looking for flexible terms to allow for early departure. Ordinarily in Hong Kong, diplomatic clauses in Hong Kong leases are normally for 2 years. Diplomatic clauses where they are accepted and negotiated into the contract typically only kick in after 1 year. If we move our consideration over to the corporate housing or temp living market in Hong Kong, we see that capacity is actually limited now of late, and continues to be so due to the increase in both relocation guests as well as business travel guests. Average daily rate rates for temp living second quarter 2024 fairly high at around $240 for 1 bed, $380 per night for 2 bed, and a whacking $650 for a 3 bed temp living or corporate housing. The average daily rate trend Q2 versus Q1 is higher. Q3 information is about to come out, and expect that to be holding the line. And 3 bed availability continues to be particularly limited in the temp living sector in Hong Kong. We look at education and international education in Hong Kong. Demographics in schools has changed fairly substantially over the past 2 years due to spaces opening up, with families having left in around a number of families having left around 2021, 2022. And these spaces being filled by children from other Hong Kong international schools as well as local students. Therefore, the turnover that we were used to seeing with expats relocating is just not happening. There are many excellent schools available in Hong Kong for expat families, offering a diverse range of curricula. International school places for primary schools are still waitlisted. The demand for places just remains high, and so for this reason, the process of shortlisting, applying to, and securing a space at a good school in the city can be challenging. There are a number of top-tier schools such as Hong Kong IS, Kellett, CNLS, Jesus, FIS, Chinese international schools, ISF, ESF, and Harrow, these are all oversubscribed already for the 2024-2025 school year. So basically, bottom line is it remains vital that applications are submitted as early as possible to at least 3 schools for the best chance of success. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my good friend Lee.
Thank you, Avram. So while what Avram mentions points to, one can argue, a robust recovery for Hong Kong with this increase in demand for accommodation, as well as what seems to be an increase in demand for children's education. But the underlying economy in Hong Kong is still quite vulnerable. That's evident in the fact that inflation in Hong Kong remains low in comparison to peer economies. So based on our most recent cost of living research, which we undertook earlier this year in March, and our September data will be published in the next 3 or 4 weeks or so. But looking at our March data, we saw local inflation based on our basket of goods and services of around 3.5%. Now, although that's higher than what we had seen in 2022 and even in 2023, it's still lower than most peer economies, places such as Singapore, for example, in the region, but also elsewhere. So the upshot of that is that Hong Kong still will remain relatively more expensive in comparison to elsewhere. But that's not due to the fact that prices in Hong Kong are increasing at a much more rapid rate in comparison to many expatriates' home locations. It's actually due to the fact that the Hong Kong currency, the Hong Kong dollar, is pegged against the US dollar. And the US dollar remains the strongest currency this year. So relatively speaking, in comparison to other locations, Hong Kong will pretty much remain towards the upper end of our lists of the most expensive locations worldwide. But the outlook for the economy still remains quite sluggish. Hong Kong's dependence or close proximity to mainland China in terms of its economy means that we're really significantly impacted by what happens there. And I'll touch more upon that when I talk about cost of living updates in mainland China. But for anybody who is currently managing expatriate staff in Hong Kong, who are paying those staff cost of living allowances or adjustments, and they'll be undertaking reviews over the course of the next, either the remainder of 2024 or into the early part of 2025, we're unlikely to see anything significant in terms of changes in cost of living allowances or adjustments. So that may be some good news, but moving on, we can then talk about China. So Meng, over to you.
Right, shifting our focus onto China, I'm going to kick off things by sharing with participants here today some of the key takeaways, the headline outputs from the WICA China Global Mobility Survey, which we conducted early part of 2024. This survey drew 95 corporate responses from around the world, 30% of whom are based in Asia, and 65% of whom based across North America and Europe. It's the first 360-degree survey into global mobility in China in almost a decade. And by 360-degree, we mean not only looking at inbound, but looking at all forms of mobility, inbound into China, outbound from China, and domestically within China. A lot of detail, a lot of data to share, but just going to share with you some of the key highlights. Some surprises, starting off with clear evidence that notwithstanding a lot of doom and gloom and negative reporting in a lot of areas across the world around developments in China and economic developments in China, China maintains its influence on company growth strategy. Fully 78.5% of the 95 survey respondents feel that China's role in their company's growth strategy is the same or even more significant than it was pre-pandemic. There's also potentially a touch of excessive optimism when it comes to volume projection or volume recovery in the various forms of mobility, but in any event, clear evidence that any talk of a dramatic decline or even collapse in cross-border or even domestic mobility activity in China is just sheer nonsense. 65% of respondents so that's 65% of 95 corporate respondents worldwide anticipating that inbound volume into China would either return to the pre-pandemic level or in fact exceed it. And those numbers become even more robust and positive for outbound and domestic, where the percentages of expecting a return to pre-pandemic levels or exceeding pre-pandemic levels hover at around 78, 79%. When it comes to considering the considerations of key drivers for mobility into, out of, and within China, it's interesting to see that talent is clearly the talent considerations or the dominant considerations for cross-border in both directions, both into and out of China. So when we talk about inbound, you have talent development, knowledge and tech transfer, and filling talent shortages, all very closely converging as the top three drivers for inbound mobility into China, which leads one to conclude that irrespective of the origin region, the need for specific skill sets and talent in China remains strong. On the outbound level, one of the more interesting findings for me personally, very similar story. The drivers for outbound, top drivers, knowledge and tech transfer, filling talent shortages, very closely conversion as the top number one reasons, and then followed by training and talent or leadership development. So it's all talent that are the drivers. And this points in the outbound context to the fact that China is increasing and consolidating its position as a source of talent regionally and interregionally, and for internal talent brokering within global companies. When we get to the domestic level, then it's back to business as usual. In the olden days, for all of those of us long enough to remember where global mobility in China began, it's actually business expansion that's the key driver for domestic. And that was the number one driver for cross-border when China opened up and Western companies started investing and growing their businesses in mainland China to begin with. It was all about expanding business, developing business. So business expansion is the number one driver, and then followed by talent considerations when it comes to domestic mobility programs. Interesting to see that tiered programs, mobility programs predominate across all three move types. Again, closely convergent. You got on the inbound level, you've got 63% of companies reporting that they tier their mobility programs into China. You've got 64% of companies reporting that they tier their domestic mobility programs in China. And then you've got 58% of companies reporting that they tier their mobility programs for outbound from China to other locations. When we look at where the inbound is actually going to, that hasn't changed at all. Tier one destinations still dominate, and if we continue to use the old school definition of tier one, which is Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, and Shenzhen, 86% of companies report that either all or most of their inbound activity into China is into tier one locations. 29% of respondent companies have some degree of inbound cross-border volume into non-tier one, And you do have 31% of respondents expecting some degree of near-term domestic volume into non-tier one locations. So talking about domestic mobility continues to evolve in China. You've got 43% of respondents reporting that they have domestic as part of their global mobility programs overall. 71% of those 43% report that they have well-defined processes and policies in place specific to domestic China. And interestingly, 95%, which is about as high as you can get, 95% of respondents to the survey talked about the fact that where they have domestic China programs, the businesses consider such programs to be either important, quote unquote, or very important, quote unquote, to the business and the development of business. And then finally, looking at challenges, well, I know it's going to shock everybody on the call, but cost is the dominant challenge in every direction. It wins by 1,000 miles. In inbound, cost number one. Outbound, cost top challenge. Domestically, cost is the top challenge in every simple direction. When you get down to there's a difference in placing for the second best and third best challenges. So on the inbound level, cost is followed at some distance by attracting suitable candidates and hardships associated with living in China. And this is clear evidence of the hangover from the experience of COVID and the way the pandemic was actually handled and the severity of the lockdowns, particularly in places like Shanghai, where you see hardship associated with China as a challenge. We used to see that challenge maybe 20 years ago when companies first started, when Western companies and Western assignees first started moving into China, and China was considered to be something of a core hardship destination. The hardships being talked about in this context on an inbound assignment basis are different, qualitatively different from the hardships that we would have referred to or experienced back in the day. On an outbound basis, employee reluctance to accept assignments and attracting suitable candidates are additional challenges in addition to cost. And then finally, unsurprisingly on the domestic level, after cost being the dominant challenge, it's attracting suitable candidates and enticing them to move from tier one locations to non-tier one locations. So that is a zip through 43 questions and 57 pages of data in the finalized published report of the survey. So with that, I'm going to shut up and let my good friend Meng take over and tell us what's really going on in China. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks, Afra. Very insightful. On the immigration side for China, I think that China's immigration landscape has significantly changed recently, with foreign visitor numbers surging by nearly 130% year on year in the first 7 months of this year, right? This dramatic increase reflects a dual focus on revitalizing tourism and also potentially attract top international talent. To facilitate this influx, China has implemented unilateral visa exemptions treatments for certain countries. These measures aim to reduce entry barriers, making China more accessible for both short-term visitors and tourists. And we hear about them on a regular basis recently. The emphasis on attracting global talent is particularly noteworthy for the mobility industry because it suggests a more open approach to skilled immigration, potentially easing the process of companies looking at relocating employees to China in the near future. However, I think it's important to note that these policies may vary based on factors such as nationality, visit purpose, and the duration of stay. While it represents a general more welcoming stance, I think it's crucial for travelers and potential expatriates to stay informed about these specific regulations because it currently keeps changing fairly rapidly in China. So in overall, I think these developments signal a positive change in China's approach to international visitors and global talent. But it's to be seen how much simpler it gets to relocate foreign talents to China in the near future, especially when you look at the process and the duration of applying for a visa. Moving over to the housing market, the housing market in China has experienced some interesting shifts recently. Coming out of the pandemic and with the changes that's happening in most of the cities. In area adjacent to popular schools, we are seeing a lower vacancy rate, indicating a continued demand for properties in these locations. I guess that families still prioritizing proximity to quality education for their children rather than costs or locations within downtown. In the mid-range market, there are emerging opportunities for what we might call deals, suggesting some type of flexibility in pricing, potentially offering better value for those that are looking for a deal. The low-end market remains quite fluid, with more frequent changes in occupation and pricing. So, this fluidity could be attributed to economic factors and changing demographic in certain areas of the city. I think on the other side, we are pleased to know that the relocation cities return to a more normal pattern since 2022. This is a positive sign for more stabilization in the market after disruption we've seen in the recent years due to the pandemic and other factors. Interestingly, the impact on Chinese returnees on the housing market has reduced compared to what we've observed during the height of the COVID years. This normalization is contributing to a more balanced market dynamic, and so we can anticipate further ahead. Looking at 2025, I think we are cautiously optimistic. I think that's the right word to say, cautiously optimistic. I think we are just going back to more normal conditions in the housing market that we've seen pre-COVID or pre-2019. On the education side, I think the education landscape in China is showing some good availability of spots in school across the board. I think especially if you are looking at placing your children into an international school, and then for those that are looking at relocating in the near future. However, I think it's important to note that while the overall picture is positive for some certain schools, it's a little bit more challenging in schools that have a strong reputation or are in high demand. So it might be more challenging to enroll your kids in those schools. These institutions just may still have a waiting list or more competitive admission process compared to others. An interesting development that we've seen over the past 2 to 3 years is that international schools are more open now to enroll local students with different degree of or different programs for those kids. There are, for example, like the German school enrolls kids if they want to prepare ahead to go to study in Germany. And I think it's just a shift of or response to the changing demographics or the strategy to maintain the enrollment numbers, because I think a lot of the schools have struggled to keep up the number of kids enrolled in the school during the pandemic years. Tuition fees have remained relatively stable. We haven't seen significant price changes in the recent 1 to 2 years. The stability education costs can be a relief for families relocating, so or planning a budget, as well as for companies that are considering costs as a major driver, as Avram mentioned before. And then yeah, moving on to Leaf to give an update on the cost of living.
Thank you, Ming. So a pretty similar pattern is seen within mainland China, as per what I mentioned a few minutes ago in relation to Hong Kong. Although actually in mainland China, it's actually more pronounced. So whereas in Hong Kong, we've seen not much in the way of change in cost of living, relatively stable, albeit relatively low rates of inflation. What we've actually seen in China is we've seen very low rates of inflation in China. And in certain cities, we've actually seen what we call deflation, where prices are actually overall now lower than they were in our previous survey. So the consequence of that is that cost of living indices for most cities in China actually fell on a year-to-year basis between our survey in March 2023 and our survey in March 2024. And once again, we'd expect to see that when we publish the results of our September data in the next few weeks. So the causes of that were, first and foremost, the relatively low rates of inflation that we've seen in mainland China relative to other locations, and also the decline in the value or depreciation of the renminbi against most major currencies over the course of the last 12 months, on account of the fact that the economy has not improved owing as a consequence of the relaxation of the zero COVID strategy that many people were anticipating when that first happened in 2022. We've obviously seen that the central government in China has made efforts to impact this by trying to either stabilize the economy or elsewhere to actually enhance or improve the economy. We've seen the impact of that very recently in terms of interest rate cuts by the People's Bank of China. We've also seen the government promoting companies or state-owned enterprises to buy back shares in order to improve share prices and foster consumer sentiment. But most of this, what we call investment, that has been targeted over the course of the last few months in response to the economy, isn't really going into the pockets of the consumer. A lot of it is going towards manufacturing, asset prices, trying to again prevent real estate prices from falling any further, and this is particularly the case in second and third tier cities. So all of this massive kind of like stimulus that we're seeing, we're not necessarily seeing that in going through to an improved element in terms of the consumer sentiment. So we're not seeing consumers spending more, particularly on day-to-day goods and services. So that's not necessarily going to lead through to much in the way of an inflationary pressure in China over the course of the next, again, 3 to 6 months. So the consequence of this is, again, very similar to what I mentioned in the case of Hong Kong. What we're going to see over the course of the next 6 months is pretty much business as usual. We will still continue to see relatively low rates of inflation. We're not necessarily going to see a strengthening or appreciation in the value of the renminbi versus most major currencies. So that essentially means that cost of living indices will either at best continue to remain as they are, or at worst, they'll actually continue to fall as other locations' currencies strengthen against the renminbi, or we see higher rates of inflation in many expatriates' home locations. So this will obviously present a challenge for companies who are sending staff into China who do provide their staff, their assignees, with cost of living adjustments or allowances as part of their overall package. Because what this means is that as part of the upcoming reviews, we're likely to see the value of any cost of living indices and therefore any cost of living allowances decline in comparison to the previous review for each employee. So that will obviously be important because that means that anybody who's currently managing or will be responsible for communicating salary reviews to their expatriate staff will obviously therefore need to be prepared to explain why any cost of living adjustments are falling and why, even though they're falling, that doesn't necessarily mean that employees will be worse off in comparison to 12 months ago or even 2 years ago. So that's basically where we're at with China in terms of costs of living. And back over to you, Meng and Avram.
That brings us to the end of the webinar. If you have any questions afterwards, feel free to reach out to any of us or reach out to ATMA as the organization. Yeah, and then we'll be sending the recording to everyone that has registered, so you can review it. And if you have any questions later on, we are always staying available. Thank you, everyone, for joining.
Thank you, everyone.
Have a good day ahead.
Thank you.
I know. Thank you. Bye.